Now, programming from the Illinois Channel, an independent, nonpartisan corporation formed to provide nonpartisan coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois. For more information on the Illinois Channel, please visit our website at www.illinoischannel.org.
Just ahead, we head to the House floor for a debate over a stopgap budget that would fund K-12 education for a full year and other government departments through the end of December. Following that, in about 50 minutes from now, Governor Rauner is joined by House Minority Leader Jim Durkin and Senate Minority Leader Christine Radogno as the three react to the passage of the stopgap budget funding K-12 education and other government departments. Then in about 1 hour and 10 minutes from now, we talk to Representatives Fred Crespo, Jack Franks, and Will Davis and get their reactions to the passage of the stopgap budget. And finally, in about 1 hour and 40 minutes from now, we talk to David Altig, Director of Research for the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, about how the Federal Reserve sets interest rates in the economy. That's all just ahead, after a brief word from one of our Advisory Council members.
Anyone who drives across Illinois will guess that agriculture is our #1 industry. In fact, agriculture accounts for 1 in 7 jobs in the state of Illinois, and the grain and feed industry contributes over $10 billion annually to the state's economy. Hi, I'm Jeff Adkisson, Executive Vice President of the Grain and Feed Association of Illinois. The fields of corn and soybeans and grain elevators and feed mills that dot our landscape are all part of a vast interconnected system of commerce that employ tens and thousands of your fellow citizens. But like most businessmen, our members are concerned with issues such as taxes, government regulations, fuel costs, and environmental concerns. That's why the Grain and Feed Association of Illinois works to communicate our concerns on those issues to the people in government who write our laws. With so many jobs at stake, it's important for us to keep the lines of communication open between those in agriculture and those in government. That's also why the Grain and Feed Association of Illinois supports the work of the Illinois Channel. Its coverage connects all of us to events at the state capitol, like coverage of the Senate and the House Agriculture Committee hearings, as well as other public policy events that occur throughout the state of Illinois. We all need to stay connected to the events and the issues in Illinois, whether we live in rural communities or in our largest cities. And that's what we get from the Illinois Channel. The Illinois Channel, it works for all of us.
Next, from Springfield, we head to the House floor for a debate over a stopgap budget that would fund K-12 education for a full year and other government departments through the end of December. This runs about 50 minutes.
Leader Curry, on the human services portion of this budget, this includes some payments for those who were under contract, but those contracts were subject to appropriation for FY16.
Yes, and it will also include contracts for some of those that were not offered contracts, but who have continued to provide service. So there are really two groups: the ones that were given contracts, and it was suggested that when the money was appropriated, they'd get paid. And there were some groups that were not given contracts, but those also are covered under this scope.
But it does not fully...
Only to the extent that they actually provided services.
Services, correct, sure. But it does not... The amount of appropriation is not sufficient to fully cover those contracts.
In fact, I would say it's about 65% of what all those contracts would have been worth had we done this as a whole process.
So I was not part of the working group. Is my understanding, though, that there was some discussion in the working group about what might happen if and when we actually reach a full resolution and have a budget that we might anticipate actually doing something, whether it's borrowing or an appropriation, that would fully fund all of those contracts?
There was discussion. In fact, in the working group, we did not reach a conclusion about all of the human services, and that decision was made ultimately by the governor and the 4 leaders. the funding for those entities that did not have contracts in fiscal 16.
Right, but for those, even for those that did, is there some plan for, I mean, they performed the services under a contract and they were encouraged, as I understand, by the governor's office to continue performing those services despite the fact that they were not being paid. Is there some plan for getting them paid at some point?
My recollection is we plan a grand bargain that will go back to the working group, led as this one was by Tim Nuding from the Office of Management and Budget, and the effort then will be to find a way fully to fund state government for the remainder of the fiscal year 17 and for those items that were left fully funded in the first half of the fiscal year.
To the bill, as I think everyone in this chamber is, I'm relieved that we're finally doing something, and I applaud all the work that's been done to get here. But I think we have to be mindful of the fact that especially on the human services side, there were a lot of services provided that were encouraged to be provided, I think, by the administration, and we need to honor those commitments at such time as we are back at this and we are able to.
Mr. Martwick.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A question of the sponsor.
Sponsor yields.
Representative Curry, can you tell me how does this budget affect court orders related to Medicaid, state employee salaries, and continuing appropriations?
Nothing in this bill should have any effect on those court orders, and it is my understanding that the courts are likely to continue those orders. I believe some lawyers are going back into court just to make sure, but that would be the intent of this bill. We did not fund those programs by and large in Senate Bill 2047 because they were already funded through consent decrees and court orders. It's my expectation that those will continue on unchanged.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Franks.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to speak to the bill, if I may. I know that I'm in the minority, and I know this is going to pass. We all understand what's happening here today. I just think that the people of Illinois deserve better than this. And I oppose this measure because I believe we're kicking our problems down the road and, frankly, making them worse. Nothing of what we're doing here will fix the financial problems of this state. In fact, just the opposite will occur. Our financial situation will deteriorate further as a result of our actions today. I think that both sides are afraid to face the voters and tell them the truth as to why this body is refusing to do its constitutionally mandated job, which is to pass a balanced budget. This is not balanced. We are knowingly, willingly violating the Constitution. Neither side wants to face the voters because they don't want to tell them the truth that we have refused to work on pension relief, even though the Supreme Court made a decision about 14 months ago. Neither side wants to tell the truth that as a result of our inability to change the school funding formula and to have the state finally pay its constitutional obligations of being the primary source for school funding, that our property taxes will continue to rise and more people will flee this state. Neither side wants to tell the voters the truth because of our actions today of kicking the can down the road, that after the election, what they're going to be seeing is a massive tax increase that will not only increase their income taxes, but will also have taxes on services and goods and probably also on sugary drinks. I don't believe there's any profiles in courage today, because after we leave here shortly, our property taxes will remain the highest in the nation because we refuse to change the school funding formula. In fact, this body just guaranteed property tax increases. They just passed that bill. What we ought to be doing is changing our antiquated tax code. We should be closing corporate loopholes. We should actually be incentivizing job creation. We should be stopping the court orders which requires the state to pay more than we are bringing in. We just heard testimony to that effect. And what we're saying is that we will continue to spend $33 million more a day than we bring in. It's just math. Understand that we will continue to deficit spend. This isn't a solution, ladies and gentlemen. This is just a way to delay the day of reckoning. Our debt will continue to grow. Our unpaid bills will continue to grow. Our pension obligations will continue to grow. And our state will fall farther and farther behind in paying their bills. And our credit rating probably will be downgraded again. I believe this is a cowardly way to pretend that we have done something, but in reality, all we have done is to create a situation in which our problems will multiply and cause Illinois more damage. So it's time that we ought to be honest with the voters for a change. Tell them the truth that we have a dysfunctional state that's broken, it's putting politics above people, and that politics here is trumping sound public policy. Because that's what this is. This is so we can avoid the hard questions before an election. I'd ask you to look into your heart. Vote no on this. Let's stay here and let's do the real work of the people. Let's get a 2-year budget done. But this here, folks, is going to cause many, many, many more problems that it will solve. I'd ask you to please reconsider and vote no.
Mr. Harris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, I know there's an interest to get to the vote and be on our way, but permit me just a few minutes of comments, and they were going to somewhat echo what the previous speaker just said. But my outcome in terms of the vote switch that I push is going to be different than his. But you know, the people of Illinois want us to work on a budget, and after more than a year of acrimonious debate with political brickbats going back and forth between the Republicans and the Democrats, with bitter insults and words hurling between the legislative leaders and the governor, and with our constituents pleading with us, the rank and file members, to come up with a budget, after more than a year, we have come to this. And the importance of this funding cannot be overlooked. We all recognize that. Elementary and secondary education, higher ed, community colleges, the MAP recipients, the Department of Transportation projects that we don't want them to close down at midnight tonight with the attendant cost of restarting them later. We understand that. The human services and the social services requirements that are needed. This bill appropriates the federal funds that are going to come into the state. The bill appropriates monies from those other state funds, meaning that monies that have been in those funds that couldn't be expended because there was no appropriation authority, such as to the leaking underground storage tank fund, those monies can now be sent out to those folks and those companies that need them. But let us be clear. Let us not go back to our districts and tell our constituents that we have passed a budget. We have not. We have passed appropriations that fund many vital services. There's no question about that. We will have taken action on one part of a budget. But a budget contains two parts. A budget contains a part dealing with revenue and expenditures. And all we are doing today is concentrating on the spending side of the ledger. There is no consideration of balancing expenditures with the revenue that's coming in. We already know that our state's backlog of bills is big and growing. The Comptroller's website today shows our backlog of bills at $7.8 billion. $7.8 billion in backlog of bills, and this bill does nothing to correct that situation, but rather, quite frankly, adds to it. You know, we have put our state in an absolutely terrible financial situation. The increasing backlog of bills is what I call a silent cancer that is wrecking our ability to move this state forward in any positive way. The reference that was made earlier to the rating agencies, those rating agencies like Moody's and S&P and Fitch, They're going to look at what we did today, and I venture that they will issue a very harsh verdict. They will say we did nothing to correct or improve the financial position of the land of Lincoln. Now, I realize this bill must pass in order to keep Illinois, quite literally, from crumbling around us. And when it does pass, we will have acted. But in my opinion, we will not have acted responsibly, nor will we have acted in the best interests of the people of the state of Illinois. The bill's going to pass, it has to pass, but I tell you, we can do much better than this bill, and I leave you with that. Thank you very much.
Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the sponsor yield?
Sponsor yields.
Representative Curry, before you started debating this bill, there was an amendment on the board. It was amendment number 4. What was in amendment number 4?
I believe there was some specificity about community college programs for minority participation and retention in institutions of higher learning. Now that is covered by the lump sum payments that are in the bill. This added some specificity, and I think at the end of the day there was a determination that we didn't need to be specific about these programs as compared with other programs, although I think it's important that the will of the chamber that these programs are critical, are important, and need to be funded is one that I would be prepared to stand and support.
Well, under that context, and I appreciate the explanation, then why do you think we removed amendment number 4 from off the board for consideration?
I did not withdraw the amendment, so I'm maybe not the best person to answer, but I think there was a question, since the determination had been that these would be covered by lump sum spending to the community college board, there was a question, well, if we're going to line item these programs, what about all the others? So I think for that reason there was a determination that perhaps we should go back to Plan A, which is the way the bill had originally been drafted, with the support of the governor and the leaders, which doesn't mean that these programs are not critically important at all, but it does say that at the 11th hour, instead of pulling out these, we've decided to go back to the original idea.
Okay, so it's your feeling that because dollars are being lump summed to the Board of Higher Education, Illinois Community College Board, among others, that the programs that would have otherwise have been asked for in amendment number 4 may still receive funding. Do you know if that's how we can prioritize, or if that's a priority, or will they just be taken under consideration like any other grant program that rests in that agency, and the organization, the director, the board chair, presumably the governor's office of that agency will ultimately make a decision as to what receives or doesn't receive funding?
I would first of all suggest that people for whom this is a critical issue, and it is for me, that we write letters to the board, to the executive director. I think that the fact that we're having this discussion on the House floor underscores the importance to members of this chamber of those programs. Nothing in this bill undercuts those programs, and I think everyone should be clear about that. It's just that the effort to highlight some but not all of the programs that those lump sums have been used for in the past raised a whole different set of issues.
So it is possible that the governor, working with his leaders in those areas, can make the decision that these programs to support diversity in these areas aren't important enough and therefore should not receive dollars.
No, there's nothing in this bill that would lead anybody to that conclusion. And in fact, I think the very fact that we're having this discussion underscores the importance of those programs.
Well, let me explain to you why I think that's a challenge for me, because if I look back in the documents that I have in front of me and what was presented by the governor's office in terms of their stopgap measure, particularly in, say, the area of human services, there were several lines specific to African American communities that the governor's office chose not to fund. Wouldn't that be correct?
And yet, at the end of the day, they are funded in Senate Bill 2047. I think the distinction that I would draw is that those programs had traditionally been line items within various budgets. The programs that we're talking about right now, you and I, the community college programs, have traditionally been part of lump sum appropriations to the community college board.
Well, but there's still a need, I think, to determine how to prioritize programs that are meant for minority communities. And I guess I'm just concerned in lump summing these dollars to the governor's office that he won't see the priority the same way that I see them and will make decisions contrary to what we attempted to do in Amendment number 4 in terms of identifying some very specific programs that should be prioritized as it relates to receiving funding. I mean, if we take a step back into some of these communities, it's communities like the ones that I represent and other members of the Black Caucus are being hurt more than others as it relates to the challenges that we've had in passing a budget the last few years. So again, if you're saying that, yes, we're lump summing and there's the possibility of prioritizing, you are one of my leaders and I trust what you're saying. But again, that's you saying it. Ultimately, the decision rests with the guy on the second floor. Isn't that correct?
Well, actually, they're made by the community college board. But I guess I would say two things. First of all, this might be a lesson in how we begin approaching next year's budget. We might decide that we really want to do more line items, not fewer. And second, I would hold people's feet to the fire. And we had that not only opportunity, but obligation. So these are important programs, and I think it's up to us to make sure the community college board and community college staff understand how important these programs are.
Well, thank you, Leader Curry. So very, very briefly to the bill, Mr. Speaker. What I experienced just in the last hour or so is very disappointing to me. When the representative was going to withdraw the amendment, or we took a brief recess before we heard that amendment, and then subsequently the amendment was withdrawn, I heard applause from the other side of the aisle. And I couldn't understand why they would be applauding the fact that programs to help minorities are not being debated, they're not being taken into consideration, that they're not being prioritized in the way that they should be. I thought that was a little odd that we would hear that applause. As a matter of fact, I think when I made that statement, I think Leader Durkin just nodded yes. You nodded yes. So I understand that maybe you don't care about minority communities as much as I do. I get that. I get that. I get that. I get that. Well, then you should not have applauded when such an amendment was taken out of the record. Should not have done so. So am I wrong because I want to advocate for programs that benefit my community? Isn't that what we're here for? Isn't that what I'm supposed to do? Isn't that what I'm supposed to do? I'm asking you, since you stood up the first time, stand up again. Isn't that what I'm supposed to do? To do it what way? I can stand up and advocate for any program that I want to. So the amendment was taken out of the record. We aren't going to debate it. It's not a part of the bill, but I'm just expressing my displeasure with what appears to be the priority that I think is important, that apparently others don't think is important. When you can applaud the removal of something like that, that's a problem for me. That is a huge problem for me. And I understand you disagree with me, and that's fine. We disagree on a lot of things, and that's okay. But the fact that I'm going to be an advocate for what's important in my community, I unapologetically stand up for that, regardless of what anyone in this chamber has to say, and I will continue to do that. There's nothing wrong with trying to advocate for one's community in this process. Nothing wrong with it. So, Mr. Speaker, I applaud and appreciate all the work that everyone has put into this. I am a part of the budget working group. I attended those meetings, but in those meetings, it was real clear that minority communities were not a priority. And I have the documents to show the zeros in the lines that were important to minority communities. And if anybody wants to see them, come take a look at them.
Mr. Batnick.
I appreciate the timing, Mr. Speaker. Can I speak to the bill?
You don't need my permission, sir.
It's been a while. To the bill. I want to echo some of the things that the gentleman from Mount Prospect and the gentleman from Marengo said about this not being a budget and our job isn't done and so on and so forth. I don't want to go into it too much because we already have, but I also want to talk about what the representative from Champaign said, and she was right. Some people have been forgotten in this bill. There's small businesses that have been forgotten in this bill. One of the toughest phone calls I had to make today was to somebody who's owed $1 million from the Department of Natural Resources, pass through federal money. Small business, they're not getting it. And I can tell you, just because you're owed $1 million doesn't make you a millionaire. Most of the time you've paid out payroll, you're paying borrowing costs on all that. So this is a sobering time. I hope when you guys go home, you think about the small businesses, because we talk a lot about education, we talk a lot about social services. One of the things I haven't seen a whole lot on the floor is the talk about the small businesses. And by the way, those small businesses create a majority of the jobs. And by the way, those jobs are how we pay for social services. Those jobs are how we eliminate the need for social services. Those jobs are what creates the money that allows us to pay for education and everything else. So I do intend on supporting the bill, but I wanted to be clear that I'm very unhappy with where we are and we can do better. Thank you.
Mr. DePetti.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the sponsor yield?
Sponsor yields.
Leader Curry, I think that you heard a very impassioned speech from Representative Davis, who I fully agree with on all issues. I think that we're seeing that there is not an appetite to accommodate minority communities in terms of the priority list. Having said that, I'd like to make sure that I understand the dollar amount that we're actually voting on today. And in the memoranda that was provided to us before we began this morning, we have certain areas of the budget that are outlined, and I want to make sure that I understand how much money is actually being allocated for each of these particular areas. Is that okay?
Sure.
All right. So with respect to P12 education, it's my understanding that that dollar amount is $7 billion. Is that correct?
That's about right. It's 361 additional dollars in general state aid.
Right. And with respect to higher education, it's my understanding that that dollar amount is $1 billion. Is that
Just
correct?
about right.
All right. And then with respect to human services, that dollar amount is $700 million, correct?
Correct.
And then with respect to agency operations, that dollar amount is, again, $700 million, correct?
That sounds right.
And give or take a dollar or two, the area of the budget that deals with capital, which is primarily based upon the relief for the engineers and the road builders and the other IDOT folks, is in the ballpark of $16 billion. Is that correct?
First of all, that also includes EPA, so water safety, those kinds of issues are covered here as well, and also some very specific capital development board projects. Remember, too, that that dollar amount reflects multi-year funding, the $15 billion that you referred to.
Correct. I said $16 billion. Is
Yes,
it 15 billion or 16 billion?
15 to 16 billion.
15 to 16
but
billion.
my point is only that that's not just a one-year fund, that covers several years. Remember, we talk about 5-year plans in the Department of Transportation, so you should think about that money not in terms of what we're spending this year compared to the $7 billion that we're spending on elementary and secondary education.
Understood, but at the end of the day, the proposal that's before the body today, this particular component of what we're voting on today, it's valued at in the ballpark of between 15 to $16 billion.
That's correct.
All right. And then the last component, non-general funds, that particular portion of the budget is valued at somewhere in the ballpark of $30 billion.
That's right, and that's other state funds, earmarked funds, and it also includes federal funds that flow through the state on their way to local projects.
Are those federal matches?
They're federal dollars.
Okay. Well, how many state dollars are at issue?
Some of them are matches, and some of them are just plain federal dollars that go for particular programs.
Would you be in a position to assign a percentage? And the only reason why I'm asking, Leader, is I'm not trying to challenge you on it. I'm just trying to lay the foundation for what Representative Davis was talking about as far as priorities are concerned.
Yeah, no, I can't tell you what the match, which of that $30 billion, how much of it requires a local match and how much of it doesn't.
Okay.
I mean, for example, today we talked about CTA improvements in Chicago, which we think will be able to bring in $800 million in federal transit monies, because it does require a local match, but many of these federal funds don't require a local match, and many of them do.
Okay, so can you, let me move on. Having said all of that, we've got a huge number here of billions of dollars, correct?
Yes.
And the programs that Representative Davis was talking about, for an example, the Minority Teacher Scholarship Program, that's $2.3 million, correct?
Yes, but the billions that we're talking about does include spending on capital, for example, at the schools, at higher education institutions. So it isn't as if everything is in a separate, mutually exclusive category. When I say we're spending $1 billion on higher education, that doesn't count the monies that might be in federal funds flowing through to the universities or other state funds that are going to build a new dormitory or what have you.
And that's certainly understood, and I don't dispute the importance of all of these appropriations for all of these areas. These are all vitally important areas that need appropriations. There's no question about that. I'm just trying to make sure that I understand the distinction between this huge number that we're going to vote on today versus the relatively insignificant number that there's no appetite in this chamber to address. For an example, as I said, the Minority Teacher Scholarship Program, $2.3 million. Diversifying Higher Education Faculty Program, $1.4 million. $4.1 million to providers for the bridge programs. I mean, these are also important programs as well, and I'm concerned that at the end of the day, if this bill is successful, and it will definitely have my support this afternoon, because I'm looking at the big picture, and that's what's important here, the big picture to get this done. But I would just urge the body to listen to the remarks that were made by Representative Davis and take heed that our job is by no means done. Thank you, Leader.
Mr. Sandak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to the bill. I feel duty-bound to correct the record a little bit on something. A previous speaker implied that applause was directed towards a minority group or in respect to certain line items. He's incorrect. The applause was with respect to the process. The entire amendment, Amendment 4, had not been agreed to. It was not even told to us that it was coming. The agreement was 3, and now Amendment 5. That was what was agreed to. And so when we get a last-minute amendment without a heads up, that is a breach of etiquette. It's a breach of trust. When that was withdrawn, applause was for the fact that good process and decorum was being followed. No more. So please do not take any offense beyond the process, because none was intended at all. Instead, it was directed towards trying to regain some balance of trust and confidence as colleagues. It's been a long year plus in that endeavor. We have made a small improvement in getting to this process right now. If we're going to finish the job, as others have said, on a more comprehensive level, a full budget, we had better start trusting one another and acting in good faith at all times. And that means coming to agreements, adhering to agreements, and moving on to fight another fight, come to another deal, etc. The items the gentleman brought forward are absolutely vital, absolutely important, and absolutely something that should be discussed and debated. And as I understood it, the working groups decided, for whatever reasons, the only thing we could come to today at this point is an amendment number 5, formerly 3. So be it. Handshakes occurred, deals were made, legislation was drafted and checked. And you can wave it off, but that's what was agreed to by the leaders, and that's what the deal was. And when no one came over to say, hey, a new amendment is coming, it was filed without warning. It was filed, frankly, as a breach of the deal. And that's what was applauded. It's being pulled back. No more, no less. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have to do far better going forward. Far better. And our charge is to start acting as colleagues and friends. We can debate hard, but if we're going to come to a deal, let's honor those deals and then move forward. As with respect to this bill, It is the best we can achieve at this juncture. It is far from perfect. It's called a compromise. There are aspects of it I wish were not in. There are things I wish that were. But by and large, it is the sum of a work product hard fought and honorably achieved. Vote yes.
Representative Belak.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'll be brief. I just wanted to say thank you to all the people in the General Assembly for all their work that they have done over these last couple of months, especially the working group. I've been in the General Assembly a long time, and in all that time, I don't think I've ever quite seen 14 people come together. I was totaling up almost 30 times within the last 2 months to go over all these issues. So I think that today, even though it's not a solution, we know that, but the working group did give a major framework toward the budget, and I'm hoping that people will go back to that when we come back in here to look at the full answer to the bill, and that framework is there. But this is a positive step today, I think, because of all the people that worked together and because of what happened, that the leaders and the governor came together and came to an agreement. So as of tomorrow, schools will be getting paid, children will be going to school, the taxpayers in all of Illinois who are sick and tired of the status quo and the tug of war before Democrats and Republicans have seen that we came together today into an agreement to move forward in a positive step with children going to school. The most vulnerable will get services, the seniors will get services, the prisons will stay open, and all together we will move forward. So I just want to thank everybody for being a part of that process. We all respect everybody and their advocacies for everything that they do for their districts, but we all know we need to move forward today, and we need to move forward on the regular budget. Thank you.
Representative Flowers.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and ladies and gentlemen of the House. Representative Curry, I want to take this opportunity to thank you for making it plain and clear that the money is there, but it's not prioritized. And you also stated the fact that this will set forth an example for what we need to do next fiscal year in regards to line item, what should be in the budget the way we want it to be. But as far as this bill is concerned, or the amendment that Representative Davis was talking about, Representative Davis, I just wanted to remind you, sir, that what you were talking about was a Republican agenda. It's called the public agenda. It was a report that was put out by Kerry Heitman that talked about that we have two Illinois here, one for the haves and one for the have-nots. And when it says the have and the have-nots, the have-nots said minorities as well as others. So there's all kinds of people around this state that is suffering from a lack of education. And that's the reason why there needs to be more funding for the community colleges, for the adult education and post-secondary career and technology, so we can have jobs and job training to train the adults who lost their jobs. So that's the reason why the community colleges are very important. And also in the public agenda, it talked about grant programs. This is, that public agenda, I have to reiterate again, that is a Republican bill. So this governor is responsible. This is a part of his priority, just so you will know. So getting back to my point, it talks about the grant programs, including diversifying higher education facilities in Illinois. It talks about the science and the technology and the work-study programs. It talks about the dual education. We are encouraging high school students to go to these junior colleges, but we do know that they need some help, and in doing so, they need the grants and the monies to be there. So what we're trying to do is to make sure not only are the prisons still open, but the colleges and the universities will still be open, so we can create jobs in this state, so we will no longer have the problems that we're having today. So that's what Representative Davis was concerned about, and you had the nerve to applaud and be happy that your governor's priority was not prioritized. So with that being said, I look forward to working with Representative Kelly Burke, because we will be having hearings at the junior colleges and on the junior colleges, and we will make sure that those issues are prioritized. Thank you very much.
Mr. Kay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the sponsor yield?
Sponsor yield, sir.
Representative in front of me, and trust me, I don't want to go through this, but I've heard some things this afternoon that are just absolutely astounding. Astounding. I've got the budget in front of me, 800 pages. And you know what? I don't necessarily care for it. Some things I like, some things I don't like. But, ma'am, is it not true that we had an agreement between Speaker Madigan, President Cullerton, Leader Durkin, Leader Radonio, and the governor? Is that not correct?
That's my understanding.
And that's what was in this 800 pages. Is that correct?
That's my understanding.
So the amendment and the monies in that amendment were not in this bill. When we had the gentleman's agreement last night, is that not correct?
Well, gentleman and lady, I believe
Okay,
the minority leader in the Senate is actually
Fair
a
enough,
woman,
but
not
it was
a man.
not in this 800 pages, was it?
I don't believe so, in specific terms, right.
So what we're doing, and I don't mind representing my district, we all do that, but we had an agreement, everyone walked away, and we said, good enough is good enough. Is that not correct?
I may have said that, you may have said that, certainly everybody in this chamber did not.
Right. And I think that's where we are today. None of us like it, but we know we have to continue to operate. I'm very pleased that we have gentlemen and gentlewomen who kept their word, because it may be that that's what carries us on forward. So when we start criticizing an agreement made by leadership, minority, majority, the governor, when we start criticizing that, then that doesn't bode well for the future. So I think we need to be very, very, very careful when we criticize Leader Durkin for what was perceived to be something that it was not. I've known him for a long, long, long time, and never, ever has he mentioned, suggested, or implied anything negative about funding for any community. Any community. Leader, I thank you for bringing this bill forward today. I think you did the best you could, and I think the leadership did the best they can, and what we have is what we have, and we ought to be happy that we've got this much. Thank you very much, Leader.
You're very welcome.
Leader Curry to close.
Thank you. Just first of all, for a clarification, we had one earlier on this House floor, and I think this is an important clarification as well. The suggestion was that an amendment popped up for this bill that had never been discussed or identified with members of the minority party. That is not accurate. Our staff did inform minority staff as this amendment was being discussed, described, considered before, in fact, it was filed. So we heard a lot about trust and good faith. I want to make it clear to all the members of this chamber that we did our part. I might also, when mentioning trust and good faith, let everybody know that robocalls against some of our members in what we call targeted districts started 2 hours ago. 2 hours ago, before we even adopted Senate Bill 2047. I'm not sure I consider that a sign of trust and good faith as we try to work beyond this stopgap 18-month budget bill and try to make sure we fund all of state government. To the bill, people made it clear that there are missing items, important priorities that were not clearly adequately funded in this bill. People have made it clear this is not a full and complete budget. I could not agree more. This is stopgap funding. It is meant to keep the lights on. Personally, I'd like this to be a complete budget, a full year budget, all of fiscal 17, fix our commitments from fiscal 16 as yet unmet, but that's not the option before us today. I think it's critical for each of us to do our part to make sure that those lights at least stay on until we can come to a complete resolution down the road. Keep the lights on. Please vote yes on Senate Bill 2047.
Those in favor of the ladies' bill will vote yes. Opposed, no. The voting is open. Have all voted who wish? Have all voted who wish? Have all voted who wish? Mr. Clerk, please take the record on this question. There are 105 voting yes, 4 voting no, 1 voting present, and this bill, having received the constitutional majority, is hereby declared passed. Members, an announcement. The fall veto session schedule is about to be distributed to you. We are now going to have closing remarks to this part of the session by the leaders, beginning with Leader Durkin.
Well, thank you, and I think most of you have heard enough from me today and over the past year and a half, but I first want to start and thank the people that make this happen. It's been a year and a half. It's been a lot of work. We've traveled many miles to come back and forth, sacrificing from our family, but what we don't pay attention to sometimes is the sacrifice that our staff makes for us and what they've sacrificed this past year and a half. So I want to speak on behalf of my caucus. I want to congratulate Andrew Freiheit, our Chief of Staff, Clayton Klenke, Colleen Atterbury, and all the rest of the House Republican staff for the time and the hard work, but the fantastic work you do day in and day out for us. But I also want to thank the House Democrat staff, who have done a tireless job as well, working with us. They're fine people, fine men and women that work hard, and they're very professional. And I thank you for the work that you do on behalf of your caucus. And I think we all owe them a debt of gratitude right now. So if we can just do that at this moment, I'd appreciate it. I'd like to say I'm going to miss all your faces, but I'm not. And so, in all seriousness, folks, I'm not going to talk about how we got here. There's plenty of time for that. And I said I wouldn't do that earlier. But I'm glad we did get here. And I think it's important that we did walk out of here today at the end of the fiscal year with some type of agreement. And again, as I stated earlier, our citizens, whether they're conservatives, liberals, independents, whatever you want, they want something done. They want us to agree on things and cut the nonsense. That's what we did today. So what I'm going to say is that we have learned a lesson. And the lesson that we have learned, to my friends on the other side of the aisle, when you engage the Republicans, the minority party, on the difficult issues, the most important issues of the day, we will achieve great and successful results. And that is what's happened today. That is because the Democrat Party, the majority party, has engaged the Republicans to work in a bipartisan manner to get a great portion of this impasse out of the way. So folks, I just want to say thank you for everybody, for your patience, your hard work, your dedication towards your district and also the state of Illinois, and we will see each other soon.
Chair recognizes Speaker Madigan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to extend my thanks to the members of the House, both Democrat and Republican, and also to the Democratic and Republican staff for their efforts over the last several weeks and months in helping us to arrive at this point and in passing a temporary budget. Very important work has been accomplished after serious compromise and good faith efforts, but our job is not finished. You all know there is much more to do. My view for the last 18 months has been that the most important job for the legislature is to address the state's budget deficit and to pass a budget that provides the critical services the Illinois' middle class, the elderly, children, and the most vulnerable depend upon. Last summer, we heard from many individuals, including breast cancer survivors, disabled children, elderly residents who rely upon local agencies, and many others who were losing important state funding. Democratic legislators have repeatedly urged the passage of a budget that would fund programs like breast cancer screenings for women, services for children with disabilities, meals for homebound seniors, and state funding for in-home care for the elderly. Passing a budget that meets our obligations to Illinois' middle class, frail elderly, children, and the most vulnerable has been, is, and will continue to be our most important job, not other agendas that hurt the middle class. Today's vote marks the 7th time that the House has passed a budget that did not include items from the governor's personal agenda. 7th time. Many previous efforts to implement a more comprehensive budget failed due to the governor's insistence on the inclusion of his agenda that would drive down middle-class wages and the standard of living. The difference today is that the governor has dropped his demand that his agenda be considered before a budget could be approved. We have seen with previous successful budget efforts that we can come together. We can achieve compromise. We can pass a budget when the governor's demands relative to his personal agenda that hurts families are dropped. That happened here today. This measure is a compromise. Republicans did not get everything that they wanted. Democrats did not get everything that they wanted. But this is a compromise effort that also makes important progress toward fulfilling our obligations to Illinois' middle class, the elderly, children, and the most vulnerable, progress that must continue as we move forward. While important progress has been made today, I want to reiterate that our work is not done. My priority and the priority of House Democrats continues to be the passage and the implementation of a comprehensive, full-year state budget that fulfills the promises to Illinois' middle class, the elderly, children, and the most vulnerable. This can be achieved if we can again work together towards compromise instead of focusing our agenda that would hurt Illinois' middle class, rather focus on a budget that improves the quality of life for all Illinoisans. Mr. Speaker, I thank you very much, and I move that the House stand adjourned to the call of the chair.
And now, leaving perfunctory time for the clerk pursuant to HJR 155, the House will adjourn until the call of the Speaker.
Hi, I'm Delitso Solomoyo, President of the Illinois Association of Community Action Agencies. We are an organization of 36 member agencies located around Illinois which provide needed services to our fellow citizens. It may be helping provide services at a homeless shelter or helping to provide affordable utilities to low-income people across Illinois through such programs as the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, better known as LIHEAP, or working with rural communities and helping them maintain needed community infrastructure. These are just a few of the many services provided by Illinois' community action agencies. But to provide these services efficiently and effectively, we need solid information. That's why, in addition to heading the Illinois Association of Community Action Agencies, I am also proud to serve on the Illinois Channel's Advisory Council. I have watched the Illinois Channel for years. It provides serious coverage of the Illinois legislature, public policy discussions, and one-on-one interviews with leaders from across Illinois. It's the kind of solid, in-depth information all of us need to get beyond partisan politics and political spin and just hear directly what's happening, what's being proposed, and why. I know and you know that Illinois is filled with good people. But if we are to have good, effective public policies, we need to base those on good information. We get that from the Illinois Channel. That's why I watch it, and I hope you will too. The Illinois Channel, it works for all of us.
Next, from Springfield, Governor Rauner is joined by House Minority Leader Jim Durkin and Senate Minority Leader Christine Radonio as the three react to the passage of the Stopgap budget funding K-12 education and other government departments. This runs about 20 minutes.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Today was a good day for the taxpayers of Illinois and for all interested parties, people who have been desperately looking for solutions to the problems that have confronted the state for the past 16 months. I particularly want to thank Governor Rauner for marshaling together the four caucuses to bring a conclusion, one which we feel is a good conclusion for Illinois, one which is a negotiated compromise between the parties. And Governor, thank you so much for your leadership on that. I will say this, that a lot of hard work went into this, and the men and women behind us in the House and Senate are the members who worked diligently for many months, are part of our working groups on the issues that were brought today for vote with the stopgap budget and also the other components of the bills today. So I want to thank every one of those members in my caucus and also in the Senate for staying with the program, working hard, and fulfilling their mission. But at the end of the day, folks, the real winners are the taxpayers of Illinois. We didn't get everything that we wanted. We will continue to work on a full, comprehensive budget, one that is balanced. But today is a good day for the taxpayers because we stopped the Democrat majority from passing a $7 billion unbalanced budget on the people of Illinois and every taxpayer. So the taxpayers won, and I think the most important aspect of today is that we responded to our public on their demands that we continue to work in good faith. We have for months pleaded with the Democrat majority that we are prepared to negotiate and compromise at every given stage of this process. And they finally took our advice based on the governor's recommendation, and we've reached a fair conclusion today. So with that, I want to turn this over to the Senate Republican leader, Chris Radonio.
Again, I want to extend my thanks to the governor for his leadership in bringing this together and thwarting what would have been truly a disaster for this state beginning tomorrow. Our job is not done, so I don't want to pat ourselves on the back too hard. This is only a stopgap budget, but there's a couple of really important things that are contained in that. Number one, there is no Chicago bailout. What has traditionally happened in this state is when there's a crisis in the city legislators come hat in hand and ask for a state bailout. That did not happen. We held firm on that. In the process, I think many legislators were educated. We have Republican legislators here today, but there were also Democrat rank-and-file legislators involved, and I want to thank them as well. I think that by being so intensely involved, they learned there is no honeypot of money out there. Everything must be paid for. The bill that we passed today is affordable. There are no state tax increases. It lives within our means, but it is incomplete. So we will be back. I think that we'll continue this kind of model of cooperation. This is truly a different kind of outcome than we've had before. Fully funding schools for the first time in 7 years, and that is a full-year solution. We have a lot more work to do. We need to do a full year's budget, and importantly, we need to get those reforms that will engender economic growth, which is really the way that we get out of this problem that we have. I am very pleased to say that one piece of what we passed today was a commitment to address pension reform in exchange for assistance to the city of Chicago with their pension problems. So I think everyone's realizing it's finally time we have to address this problem. I look forward to taking a little bit of a break and then getting right back to solving the larger issue. And with that, I'll turn it over to the man of the hour, Governor Rauner.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to start by thanking Leader Donio, Leader Durkin, and the entire members of the Republican caucus. They've done an outstanding job of standing up firmly on behalf of taxpayers for the state of Illinois. They have also stood up firmly for school children and their parents, homeowners, and the most vulnerable in our state. We faced a crisis when the supermajority left the end of May without passing any budget whatsoever. With no budget, obviously very dire circumstances come July 1st, road construction ending, many human services potentially going without any support, and the very grave risk of schools not opening in August and September. That would just be an unacceptable failure on behalf of the people of Illinois. Thank you to Leader Durkin, Leader Radonio, the Republican caucus, for standing firm and coming now to a grand bargain, a grand compromise to get us through this crisis. I would also like to say, personally, a thank you to President Cullerton for some flexibility and creativity in the negotiations. And I would also compliment Mayor Emanuel for some flexibility and some creativity on his part. And the Democratic caucus has been willing to compromise, and we thank them for their efforts in that regard. Let's be clear. This is just a small step in the process of making Illinois strong and healthy and vibrant. This is a small step in the right direction. This is not a budget. This is not a balanced budget. This is not a solution to our long-term challenges. This is a bridge to reform. That's what this is. This is a bridge to reform, a bipartisan bridge to reform. And the reason it was able to come together is both sides expressed willingness to negotiate further around reforms and truly balanced budgets. The Democratic leaders made it clear in recent weeks that they would not want to take any votes on balanced budgets or reforms prior to the November election, but that after the November election, there was a very distinct possibility of that. That sentiment, that expression of the possibility of reforms and a true balanced budget, ending the days that we've had for years in Illinois of unbalanced budgets and kicking the can on pensions and borrowing and not paying our bills, the willingness to actually stand up to that right after the election during the lame duck session allowed us to come together to build a bridge to get to that outcome. In this compromise, schools can open on time, and the vast majority of school districts and schools will receive more money, an affordable amount of more money. And frankly, in Illinois, our schools deserve more money from the state. This is good public policy. Schools, first priority. Also, essential government services for our most vulnerable, human services for the families most in need, our veterans, our developmentally disabled, those who are most vulnerable. The services can continue through January. Essential that we do that. Likewise, essential government services for public safety, for corrections, for public health, and services that people of Illinois depend on every day, day in, day out. Those can continue to be provided at an acceptable level, basic level, through January. Very important. And then finally, I don't want to leave out the essence of construction. We need road construction and maintenance of our infrastructure in order to keep our economy competitive and have the opportunity to grow in the future. This bridge spending plan allows us to do that. The goal is to get us till after the election in November and then between November and January, come up with a bipartisan grand compromise that will truly balance our budgets and get reforms to grow the economy, protect our taxpayers, provide sufficient resources so we can develop the best schools in America in every school district, not just in some, and also reform our political system and our process here. Clearly, we need reforms. We've been going down the wrong road, a gradual, slow decline in Illinois for years and years, with deficits, debt, jobs leaving, lower family incomes, higher property taxes, defunded schools too many times over the last 10 years, and a political system that's not really responsive to the voters and the taxpayers. Our efforts will never cease to change that. We need fundamental reform to change that direction. I believe, and I firmly hope, that right now we've hit the bottom. This is the low point in the evolution of Illinois, and now we begin to move up. Growth, value for taxpayers, better schools, and a political system that is responsive and actually making good decisions for the long-term health of the state. Not just short-term decisions, long-term health of the state. This bridge is an important trust-building, relationship-building part of the process. I'm pleased with the result, but it is not the long-term solution. This purely gives us the opportunity to come together in the next months and come to a solution that really restores the growth, protects our taxpayers, and properly funds our schools and human services. Thank you again for everyone here, for every member in the Republican caucus, and again, thank you for leaders on the Democratic side. Thank you for the flexibility and the cooperation so we could come to this compromise to move forward. With that, I'll open it up to questions.
Governor, there was a lot of closed-door meetings this week. Can you talk about when the compromise kind of came about and how that happened?
Well, this has been an evolutionary process. There's been a lot of negotiations and private meetings going on for months. They accelerated in, I would say, the last 3 months. The working groups were close to an announcement. Then that process slowed down. I think we were pretty close to a grand compromise. When the leaders made it clear on the Democratic side that while there may be some compromises to reform the state that could make sense, votes on those were not going to be attractive to be made prior to the November election. When that was made definitively clear, that's what accelerated the process for us to come up with this bridge plan, this bridge spending plan, so we can get through the election. Because it, reforms are essential, and our efforts to get significant reforms for the people of Illinois will never cease. I'm cautiously optimistic that we, in November, December, January, will see meaningful reforms. One of the reasons I'm optimistic and we're able to come together is the way we talked about our pension plan, pension reform, in the context of the city of Chicago and the Chicago teachers was very constructive, and we generated a managed roll call to vote on that pension reform plan for Chicago Teachers Union as a sign of good faith that come November we'll come together on a bipartisan basis in a comprehensive solution for major statewide pension reform for all pension systems as part of that bill hopefully becoming law. If we don't get that reforms, that bill for the Chicago teachers' pension will not become law, but if we get reforms, it will. Yes.
Worry at some point that the state is at a crisis, and Democrats say the governor will sell his turnaround agenda and we'll move on, and this is going to be a pattern for the next 4 years of the turnaround.
I don't believe that will be the case. I think that the members of the supermajority, most of them, realize that reforms are needed. And I have been receiving information that post the election that they'll be willing to take some of the votes. The working groups, bipartisan working groups, were making very good progress. And the ideas coming out of those that I heard, while not all of them that I necessarily love or necessarily want to support, they were going to be good bipartisan compromise that would move the state forward in a positive direction. And I think we can get there, I believe, in November.
What incentive would Democrats have to do that post-election? The public pressure would be off, and they wouldn't really be inclined to give you a win going into a gubernatorial election.
Well, obviously, the outcome will ultimately be impacted at least a fair bit by the what happens in the election in November. I think that if there is a greater balance in the General Assembly between the Republicans and Democrats, I think the odds of very significant reforms are much higher. If there's less balance, could be the opposite. I think we've got to see what happens.
Governor, speaking of the election, you've given money to the state Republican Party, and in turn, the Republican Party appears making phone calls. Barbara Flynn Curry said before there was even a vote on the floor, and with all of this talk of trust, that isn't helpful. I mean, slamming Democrats with these votes already. So what gives there?
The votes happened. All the votes got done. The compromise got passed. You'll see very aggressive electioneering every day going forward between now and November 8th. That's a fact, both sides. Some of the supporters of the caucus on the other side started the mailers, about 3 months ago now. It's just part of the process. It's what we've got to do. It's easy for folks to say, oh gosh, I got a mailer, so why would I take this? The political campaigning is its own process. We have a duty to govern, to manage the affairs of the state properly, to get balanced budgets, and come up with a way we can grow our economy. Our biggest challenge is we've got to become a growth state. We've got so much deficit, debt, unfunded pensions, and unpaid bills. If we don't grow, we won't solve that problem. We've got to become a growth state. We can't tax our way out of the problem. It's not possible.
Governor, given the pain that we've seen in the last year with agencies closing and people being uncertain, do you have any regrets about tying your turnaround agenda items to the budget and making, I won't pass a tax increase without those items, and you only have to stop that because you said you don't have to. Mr. Madigan said today we'll agree to him when he doesn't put those things in the budget. Has it been a mistake at all to tie that to the budget because of this full year we've waited?
So I've been very clear on two things from day one, and those two things aren't changing, and they will not change. One is I will not sign off on an unbalanced budget, and I'm not going to. And number two, I will not sign off on any new taxes without meaningful structural reform. I've been clear on that for the last year and a half, and that is not going to change.
Governor, some Democrats, this budget, though, by being complete, kicking the can down the road, set us up for large tax increases. You say you don't want to pass an unbalanced budget, but without new revenue, the state continues to be unbalanced.
Again, this is not a budget. What this is an attempt at good faith compromise to set up the possibility for a grand bargain. That's what this is about. The Republicans are supporting a short-term bridge in good faith at trying to meet the Democrats part of the way to what they wanted. And likewise, the Democrats have indicated a willingness around pension reform and other reforms in our negotiations. And this is an effort to start to build that relationship and develop the confidence. We're doing some things, and we've put in some things that isn't our first choice. They're doing some things that are not their first choice. I'm very proud of the Republican caucus for standing firm. The $7 billion out-of-balance budget that passed the House, absolutely, shockingly, failure for the people of the state. And likewise, the education funding bill that passed the Senate with close to $1 billion more in spending, with a lot of that, more than $500 million, going to the city of Chicago. That was not fair. That wouldn't be fair to the taxpayers of the state. Republicans stood firm against that. We came to a reasonable place on a bipartisan compromise, and I'm cautiously optimistic we can use the negotiations that got us here to bring a constructive resolution after November 8th.
Last question. What is November about? What's the election in November about?
I've lived in Illinois my whole life and followed the governmental political process fairly closely. In many ways, I don't know of a more important election than this one, November 8th. This election will in large part determine whether we stay on the track that we've been on for decades of job losses, lower family incomes, the highest property taxes in America, the worst credit rating of any state in America, the biggest unfunded pension in any state in America, and never, ever balanced budgets, truly balanced budgets. And school funding cut repeatedly for years. And a political system that is pretty rampant with corruption and cronyism and patronage. Are we going to stay on that track, or are we going to go in a new direction? More growth, more value for taxpayers, better funding for schools, less corruption and conflict of interest in government. This election will largely determine that outcome. If the powers, if the structure of the General Assembly stays in, where the Republican caucus has a very, very limited voice, the pro-growth caucus, the pro-growth voice is very limited, the chances to make Illinois more prosperous go way down. If the Republican caucus has a little bit of a louder voice, probably not a majority, that's not likely, well, it's possible, I could always hope, but if they have a little bit of a stronger voice and there's a little more balance, I think we have a chance to take Illinois in a very strong direction. We have the hardest working people in America, the best location of any state in America, the best agriculture, the best infrastructure. If we could get our policies in Springfield to be different than they've been and become more pro-growth, the prosperity in Illinois, the future for the families of this state could be very bright indeed. And that's really what's on the line November 8th.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everybody.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.
Hi, I'm Dan Montgomery, president of the Illinois Federation of Teachers. More than 100,000 IFT members work each day in schools, universities, colleges, and state agencies across Illinois. They're professionals who teach our students, keep our public buildings safe and clean, and provide critical state services, and much more. As an advocate for our members, their professions, and those we serve, the IFT works in Springfield to support legislative policies that promote high-quality schools and public services. We also fight to protect collective bargaining rights for all our members and all working men and women. We do this through an organized program of advocacy and year-round monitoring of public policy proposals. And that's why the IFT is proud to support the work of the Illinois Channel, whose coverage connects us to legislative debates and committee hearings, as well as interviews with leaders on key issues like the state budget, tax policy, public pensions, and education funding. Funding education is one of the primary responsibilities of Illinois state government, so we should all pay attention to the policies being proposed and how they may help or harm our children's futures. You know, what's happening in the State House today directly impacts what happens in classrooms tomorrow, and what happens in classrooms impacts the future of our state and our nation for decades to come. I'm Dan Montgomery, president of the Illinois Federation of Teachers, and I'm proud to serve on the Illinois Channel's Education Advisory Board. The Illinois Channel, it keeps us all connected.
Next, from the state capitol, we talk with Representative Fred Crespo, one of those who participated in crafting the spending bill that will fund state services through the end of December and elementary education for a full year. This runs about 7 minutes. Representative Fred Crespo, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel.
Thank you.
So after 18 months of waiting, we now have a spending bill that's been passed to at least keep the wheels from entirely coming off.
Right.
Can you give us, first of all, give us a little bit of the details of what the bill actually does?
Well, primarily, I was part of this work group that we've been meeting now for almost 4 weeks and laying the framework for the speaker and the leaders to decide what they're going to do. There's a couple of principles that we were following. Number one, we had to make sure that it was based on existing funds. So that was one of the the premier things in this framework. Secondly, we need to come up with a budget for the entire year for education, K through 12, and then also make sure we had enough money to keep us all at least operating through the end of the year for operations. There were some pressure points. Department of Corrections was a huge one for the governor as well for some members, so we need to make sure that we provided funds for that. Projects, road projects and bridges that needed to be repaired, that was a big pressure as well. So we provided money for that. So it gets us through the end of December. It's not a final product, but I'll tell you, I've been part of like at least 4 different work groups, and it's nice to know that at least one of them was able to get the job done.
Relative to the dollars, and you were saying what available funds, what is the top line? I wasn't sure. How much was just being spent there? Do you know?
We talked about, number one, education was a big one, was $7 billion. And keep in mind that this was a combination of GRF, general revenue funds. There were other state funds as well. And we also need to appropriate, give the government the authority to spend the federal dollars. So we're talking about billions and billions of dollars. It all depends how you break it down, but it was a big number.
And on some of the items, so as you say, the federal dollars, even those dollars might be sitting in an account, we couldn't spend them without having the legal authority of passing a bill, right?
Yeah.
So am I right that now road construction will be able to continue?
Correct.
And what about something like the LIHEAP program? Do they get their funds in?
The LIHEAP, that was taken care of even before this budget. It's something that we were able to, actually it was a bill that I introduced during the regular session, and we did fund that through the end of the year. So that was not part of this because it's already been taken care of.
But they'll get their federal funds when those come, like I think in November, if I recall.
Correct. So they do have the authority to spend those funds for LIHEAP, and we also did appropriate the other state funds that we collect in the utility bills to pay for the LIHEAP program.
Try not to keep you too much more, but just a couple more details. Let's say on the MAP grants, we didn't have a 2016 spending. So does this fund the MAP grants in arrears? Where are we on that, since we're talking about both the fiscal year 2016, which ends today, and fiscal year 2017, which begins tomorrow? Tell us where are we on the MAP?
Just to give you some background, and the governor's introduced a stopgap proposal. They did not include money for MAP grants. So as part of the team that we put together, we did negotiate to put money for MAP, and we decided the best way to, there's limited resources, to spend that money was to make sure that we paid the colleges for 2016, make sure that they're made whole. As you all know, a lot of these colleges pretty much floated those MAP grants to the students, but we had heard that there were some colleges that were asking the students to pay them back. So we want to make sure we relieve that pressure, so they will be funded for 2016. We're going to come back in November, and we're going to have a discussion of what to do in 2017.
And on the higher ed, K-12 is funded throughout the whole year. What about the higher ed? Is that a partial?
It's a partial, so they're getting funded. It all depends on the colleges, up to like 70 or 80% for the last 18 months.
Lastly, there's been so much contentiousness, which is why we've been at loggerheads for so long. You know, people. Is this a standalone, or does this portend that maybe we'll have better cooperation on a forward-going basis? Do you have any feel for how the working relationship was, and now that you have these working groups that you participated on?
Well, I can tell you this, Terry. You know, I've been part of 4 different groups. And I'll tell you, behind closed doors, when we meet with the governor's office, it's a very cordial meetings. We have some of the right folks at these meetings. The speaker mentioned this in his closing today. This is the 7th time this year that we've been able to pass an appropriation bill. 6 times. There's one common denominator, and that is that there's no turnaround agendas tied to it. So I think we need to take a step back and consider that as we move forward, not to say that we cannot talk about the turnaround agenda items. I think we should meet and have those discussions, but some of those items, as I've told the governor's office, will require some time. If you remember, when we passed the pension reform bill several years ago, it took us 3 years to get to a point where we had a product that we can vote on. When we passed workman's comp reform several years back, it took us 2 years to get to that point. So some of the turnaround agenda items that the governor has been pushing for, I think we can sit down and have a conversation, but we need to look at history and realize that this is going to take a while. And I think that's where the biggest disconnect is. We're required to pass an annual budget, and I repeat, an annual budget every year, and if you tie that to an agenda that's going to require 2 or 3 years, it just doesn't reconcile very well. So I think we should have those discussions, but they should be independent and separate of the budget discussions.
All right, Representative, thank you.
Oh, great.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Next, from Springfield, we talk to Representative Jack Franks and get his reaction to the passage of the stopgap budget. This runs about 8 minutes.
Representative Jack Franks, thanks for joining us. You are one of only 4 members to vote against the SB 2047 that was going to be funding the state on a partial basis, I guess, through the end of the year and education for the year. What was the reason that you voted no on this?
Because it wasn't real. It's not a real budget. We have a constitutional obligation to pass a balanced budget, and this wasn't balanced. Actually, I think this might be worse than the budget that the governor didn't want to sign that was $7 billion unbalanced. This could actually be worse because we're spending $33 million more a day than what we're actually bringing in pursuant to the court orders, which is almost $1 billion a month. Now we've added billions and billions on top of that. So over these next 6 months, we could add another $10 billion to our budget deficit. So as a result, it's going to put incredible pressure to raise taxes on income taxes, raise taxes on services, as well as create a whole new taxes on a host of other things. But what we saw today was damning the state to the largest tax increases in modern history.
As you noted in your floor address on the bill, the Constitution requires a balanced budget, and as you just mentioned, we don't have one. So how do we, you had said, again on the floor, let's stay here and do it right. That didn't happen. It's not going to happen. How do we ever get, given the political realities that we have between the leadership of the governor, Speaker Madigan, et cetera, how does this state ever get back to having a balanced budget?
We need to change our reality. The fact is, that's why we have elections. And the only reason this terrible, treacherous bill was passed today, it was so the General Assembly didn't have to be honest with the voters. So they didn't have the guts to face the voters and tell them what's coming down the pike. So instead of making the cuts that were necessary, or talking about additional revenues, which I wasn't going to support because I've got a bill out there that will close a lot of corporate loopholes that will add billions of dollars of additional revenue without a tax increase. But what this was about was really about the election. So if we're ever going to change this, we have to really consider when we're pulling the lever who we're voting for and who's going to tell them the truth and who's going to do the right thing. And people will have that opportunity on November 8th.
What, in your estimation, again, so schools were funded throughout the year, but not government. Government's funded until after the election through the end of the year. What's going to happen at the end of the year when this funding bill expires and we're already past the election? What would you tell the voters is going to happen?
They are going to see the largest tax increases in modern Illinois history. Incredible tax increases, billions and billions and billions of dollars in tax increases on a whole host of new things that have never been taxed, as well as your income tax and your property taxes are now going to go up. That's what happened today. There was nothing to celebrate. There was no profiles encouraged today. What this did was kick the can down the road in order for people to get elected again.
So what might happen, taking your scenario, is they're going to raise the income tax.
Yep.
To some level. They authorized Chicago to be able to raise property taxes. Yeah. And they may go to, which a lot of people have argued we need to do, pass change the tax law so that we can tax services. Correct. And expand, as you were saying, tax things that were not taxed in it before, maybe like haircuts and those kinds.
Right. You're going to see a host of new taxes and fees. And I think you're not going to see a lot of job creating, incentivizing in the state of Illinois. So what I think you're going to see, the end result of what happened today, is more people fleeing Illinois and less job creation. We didn't do anybody any favors today. Matter of fact, we made the problem much, much worse. I'm not going to say we, I'm going to say they did it, because it was both sides. I got up there and I was one of very few people that got up and told the truth on this.
Did we get to a point, well, on one hand, that people just want to go home. We're here on the verge of July, and it's an election year, and people want to go home and start
So what?
with the campaigns.
So
I'm just saying.
Yeah.
But I started to say, did we reach a point where it was just fatigue here and people, kind of threw in the towel and
No.
didn't want to stick to their guns as you're saying they should have?
No, it's a concentration of power where very few people have an input on what can happen. And that's another structural problem we have in this state. I've always believed in term limits for leadership. And the problem is when very few people in a room make a decision and then expect everyone else to follow them, it's a problem. But it also is coupled with campaign finance reform. With the huge amounts of money coming into our state and being spent on these campaigns, we saw today that some people have already started robocalls against folks who voted for this. This was all about the election. And it's always going to be about the election in this state until we put campaign finance reform and term limits and fair maps. We need to fundamentally change what's going on in the state, or you're going to see a repeat of this every year.
Was there a number of the things that the governor had on his turnaround agenda? Where do you stand on the argument that those items shouldn't be part of the budget debate?
Well, they should be separate. I believe they should be separate, and I've advocated for those things. I carried the bill. I've carried all those bills, actually. And I've even passed a bill to freeze property taxes. But unfortunately, the governor didn't support it because he'd rather bust unions. He needed that part of it. Let's keep these things separate. I think I think our citizens need real property tax relief, and we're not getting it from Springfield because of the gamesmanship.
And what's your future going to be? Now, you decided not to run for re-election. And you've already, for those that don't know, as I said, you're officially a Democrat, but you really kind of just follow your own course. Right. And to your credit, a lot of people don't want to do that. But now you're not going to be seeking re-election? Are you announcing your plans?
Yeah, I don't like either party. Because it's really not about public policy. It's about power. It's never about the people. It's about who can get what for themselves or their family or friends. It's cronyism. It's on steroids in this state at every level. So I plan on, since I think Springfield is so fundamentally off the rails right now, and I don't see it getting better in the short term. I think I can do the best for the constituents by going home to McHenry County and leading the county board. It's our first time we're having an election for it, and I want to implement these reform ideas that I've passed in Springfield of consolidation of government and real property tax relief. And I want to reduce the size of the county board, and I want to show how government can be efficient and responsive. And I'll have a laboratory in McHenry County to get that done, and I'm looking forward to fundamentally changing how government's done in Illinois and to show how it can be done right.
Well, you've always been a great guy to talk to. We wish you well, and hopefully we can come up and visit you in McHenry County and see what we do.
Anytime.
Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot.
Next, from Springfield, we talk to Representative Will Davis and get his reaction to the passage of the Stopgap budget. This runs about 13 minutes.
Representative Will Davis, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel as we just had the vote on the bill that will now fund education, K through 12 for the whole year, and government operations through, the end of the year, I guess, until the effective end date is what, January 1st? It stops on...
I guess technically that's the end date, but we gave a lot of discretion to the spending agencies, universities, state agencies, to look back into the current fiscal year, which is 16, and maybe there's some items they want to pay from 16, and then to continue on into 17. So it's not a true 18-month budget, but it allows for, again, some back spending into the current fiscal year that ends on the 30th of June, but it also allows for then moving forward spending into the new fiscal year, which starts July 1.
During the debate, you had caused some consternation on the floor by, well, first of all, maybe we should back up and say there were different versions of the bill that were coming out. Yes. And there was one version that that was introduced, and I believe it would have had, what, $10 million? What would have it had that was then stripped from the bill?
Well, the amendment would have provided, well, it would have prioritized spending for essentially 4 different programs that are important to the Legislative Black Caucus. One is diversifying education, higher education in Illinois program, which helps to create a pipeline for minority teachers that can then be hired at schools here in the state of Illinois. It would have also funded bridge programs, so this money would have gone to community colleges to help students of color who are making their transitions from community college to four-year institutions. It would have also provided resources for a program called Grow Your Own Teachers, which is kind of an alternative teacher education program, but allows non-traditional students to be able to go back to school and start to get the necessary credentials to ultimately become teachers, as well as minority teacher scholarships.
And as I understand this, what happened is there was an agreement. Yesterday was a long, prolonged meeting with the leaders, and they basically came to an agreement on paper, or in principle, I should say, and that is ultimately what came up. Now, there was one version between that agreement of yesterday and today where the items you just mentioned, and I think it would have been funded, what, $10 million worth of those?
The funding level would have been $10 million. Well, mind you, this wasn't new funding. I mean, there are lump sum dollars that are automatically going to the Board of Higher Education, the Illinois Community College Board, as well as the State Board of Education. These dollars could have been used to help fund these programs, but the challenge would have been prioritizing those programs. And so the amendment, while it's pointed out those programs specifically, was merely to say, we want you to prioritize the spending for these programs. So it wouldn't have been any new money. I think the governor's office.
So it's not $10 additional. It would have just said, of the monies that are available, we want you to prioritize them for the programs we already discussed.
For the programs, I think the governor's office even characterized it and said that if we do this, then that $10 million is coming out of human services. Well, again, that would have been a false statement, because at the end of the day, like we've done in the past when we've passed spending plans, this is merely a spending plan. And now you have to find the revenue to come behind that. So it wouldn't have taken any more money out of higher ed. It didn't increase necessarily the dollars that were being made available to support this spending plan. It would have basically said, you need to prioritize your spending, and here are some areas that we would like to prioritize that spending. So it didn't do anything the way it was characterized, but yes, was it brought in after the discussion, after the quote-unquote handshake, I think as one of the representatives characterized it? Yeah, that would have been the case. But nevertheless, if you dug down into it, again, it didn't cost, if you will, any additional dollars, nor did it take any money away from another spending area.
And so with that in mind, then you took to the floor. And one of the comments that riled the Republicans, as I would characterize it more or less, said to Leader Durkin that he didn't care as much about minority communities, I guess, as you did, which is a subjective judgment, which I suppose depends on your perspective. But I suppose the question I would frame is, some people would say, Will, you're a gentleman, you're not a bomb thrower. Why would you point out one member on the House floor and say that? I mean, why did you do that? Was that a spontaneous thing, or did you feel that Representative Durkin had specifically been responsible for having this stripped out of it?
Well, the way Representative Durkin's name came up in the conversation is that, again, as the amendment was being tossed around, so to speak, and ultimately it was removed from consideration, there was applause from the Republican side of the aisle. And I took that to mean that, wow, great, we don't have to deal with these minority programs anymore. And that's the way that I couched comments. And so it wasn't specific to him, but he's the one that then, when I talked about what their reaction was in terms of the applause, he nodded his head in agreement as if, yeah, we did applaud that. So that's where it came specific to him, because of his reaction to my statement. Now, for obvious reasons, I'm going to care more about African-American communities than him. And that's not to say that African-Americans don't live in his district. But when you take a step back and look at this entire process, when the Black Caucus in particular has been advocating for programs, particularly in human service, that help support African-Americans, where were the Republicans? They stood with the governor in terms of the budget that he presented, where programs like that were either reduced, so significantly reduced, or eliminated. So I'm looking at that history. So it's not just about this one moment in time. There are several moments in time where when Leader Durkin would talk about supporting the governor's budget, he in essence is supporting the reduction in spending on programs that are important to the Black Caucus, to minorities throughout the entire state of Illinois. So again, he can look at it in terms of one item or that moment in time, but I'm looking at the complete history of it, and that's what the history of it has shown. When we were in those working group meetings, and as an appropriations chair, I was able to participate in those, the governor's stopgap budget, the one that he presented, shows a lot of zeros in line items that are specific to African Americans. So again, this is their budget. So I don't have any reason to think that they necessarily think that those items are priorities. If they did, then there would at least been some level of spending in them. Now, maybe I would have wanted more, but at least I can say he's interested because there would have been some dollars spent there and not zeros. So that's the context that maybe Durkin doesn't understand, because I get it, he's a leader and he's not in those working groups, but I'm in those working groups. I'm looking at those documents, and that's what those documents tell me.
And I'll say for the viewers that sometimes they look at the excuse me, legislature as a body of the whole. I mean, they just look at it as a group. I would argue to really have a good understanding of the way at least the House of Representatives certainly works, as well as the Senate, but maybe to a lesser extent. Every member, you being one, is an advocate, almost like a lawyer representing a client. You're here to represent as an advocate for the people that you represent. Right. You're their voice. Right. And it would stand to reason that you go to bat for them. And if your people are having, coming out on the short end of some budgetary item, then obviously you're going to raise that as an issue and flag it. And that, I would say, that's to be expected by any member, right? I mean, if you're not getting your library or whatever it is you were urging or pushing for, then, you know, you're going to not take that in a happy form, and I suppose you shouldn't be, or you wouldn't be a good advocate.
And you know, it's interesting, you know, how people respond to things, because again, I talked about not prioritizing issues in the minority community, and Leader Durkin apparently took offense to my characterization, and that's fine.
Well, I think it maybe was misunderstood, but as if you were almost accusing him of being insensitive to the needs of the minority community, or you know, that he took it as a personal insult.
Well, he's not advocating for it. Again, when I look at some of those line items and I see zeros there, all I can say is that if he supported what the governor presented, then he in essence supporting reductions or elimination of programs that are specific to the minority community. But essentially the point that I was trying to make was, again, he took offense to my characterization of that, you know, at him. But when you talk about the things that members say, you know, we had a member from his side of the aisle make a very disparaging comment about women, you know, who are on birth control or who utilize birth control. I don't believe he stood up and said my member shouldn't have said that, or that was wrong to say. So again, if he's about just making sure that those comments that are being made that are appropriate, you know, or if they're inappropriate, then he should be willing to stand up for anything that's said or being done that's inappropriate. Just the same manner that no reason why he can't be an advocate for programs for African American communities, just like I'm an advocate for programs that support everyone in the state of Illinois.
So let's just wrap. And basically, where do we go from here? We put a Band-Aid on this. We didn't really solve the problem. When we come back in January, we're going to be out of money. The schools will be funded, but other items will need to be passed. You'll be past the election. What happens then? Are we going to have a repeat of the standoff, or do you think that this portends greater cooperation going forward?
Well, I think many members would say this is what we can do when we cooperate, but there are still some serious looming items out there. In those budget working groups, this stopgap measure was supposedly taking the dollars that we have available to try to fund government. But in the broader context, when we talked about a full-year budget, there was a conversation about the need for additional revenue. So again, we still have yet to have that conversation, the need for revenue to help continue to fund the things that we want to fund. Again, this stopgap requires us to come back together because, again, we call it an 18-month budget, but truly it's not a real 18-month budget. I mean, literally, universities and other agencies could run out of dollars come November.
Well,
By
and
the
some
time-
of this is funding like backlog. In other words, filling in the bills we ran up by not having a budget previous.
Absolutely. So we can't look at this as a true 18-month budget. So who knows that maybe you need to come back even before veto session or before the election and try to address some of these concerns as well. So, and the fact that, again, we're still just talking about only essentially a half a year in the new fiscal year. So we know we've got to come back. Should we wait till January to come back? Probably not. I mean, veto session presents an opportunity, when we will be back here for those purposes, but also since we are here, we can engage in those conversations at that time. We don't have to wait to January to start talking about what we do for the next 6 months of the fiscal year. Those conversations can start. They could start immediately, but I know there will be some time, but they are in earnest could start in November during veto session.
Representative Will Davis, we appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good luck, Davis.
Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Bob Myers, president of the Associated Beer Distributors of Illinois. You know, there have been many increases in the number of choices of beers now available in the marketplace. Independent beer distributors offer consumers thousands of craft, domestic, and imported beers from over 3,000 breweries. Whether you're purchasing beer in a restaurant, a grocery store, or a convenience store, it's the beer distributors that make the delivery, keep track of the inventory, and ensure that the product you are buying is fresh. We're also responsible for recording how much beer is sold and ensuring that the state taxes on those sales are collected. And because we want everyone to drink responsibly, beer distributors play the central role in the three-tier system that regulates beer from the brewery to its distribution and final sale at a retail location. Working in a highly regulated industry is just one reason we also support the work of the Illinois Channel. When new laws are proposed, new taxes, or new regulations, we all need to stay connected to know how these proposals may change how we live and work. I'm Bob Myers, president of the Associated Beer Distributors of Illinois, who are proud to help keep you connected.
Next, we speak with David Altig, Director of Research for the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. We learn how the Federal Reserve establishes interest rates in an effort to help spur sustainable growth in an economy. David Altig, thanks for joining us on the Illinois Channel. We wanted to glean a little bit of what you're looking at as far as when you look at the economy and where we are now and where we might be going as a society, and then also maybe you can tell us a little bit about what the Fed does and how you put together your numbers. So as someone who works in research for the Fed, let's just a basic view. What is your job and how do you go about doing it?
Sure. So my boss is the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta is one of 12 reserve banks in the country, each with their own presidents, and they serve with the Board of Governors in Washington to set the course of monetary policy via the Federal Open Market Committee for the United States. So when you hear people talking about what's going to happen to interest rates, often they're talking about us.
For those who don't speak, as I say, economic geek, people, as you probably know, will use interchangeably fiscal policy and monetary policy. It's not the same. Tell us what monetary policy is.
Well, monetary policy really is about regulating the supply of money in the economy, but more kind of directly, we influence short-term interest rates, which then influence longer-term interest rates and the sorts of prices people pay for mortgages and auto loans and those sorts of things. It's not a direct control of those things, but it's an indirect control to influence the economy. Mainly, we're charged with on inflation and employment.
And the Fed would look at how the economy is performing, and you might decide that the economy is starting to slow down, in which case you might cut interest rates to put more money back into the system and to goose the system a little bit, if I can use that phrase. Conversely, you might, if you see inflation starting to creep up, raise interest rates just to kind of tap the brakes and slow it down so we don't get runaway inflation. Is that more or less a policy?
That's pretty much exactly what the strategy is.
Now, you take the temperature of the economy through a number of different metrics. What would be some of those metrics, and how do you gather the information?
Well, the most important ones are the ones that are directly related to our responsibilities or our congressionally mandated objectives. That would be inflation, which we measure by a measure of consumer prices, and employment growth. Both of those things are statistics that are collected by the official statistics agency of the United States. So we look at, in some sense, at the very same data that you will pick up and read in the newspaper on those items.
Now, just recently, the Department of Labor in federal government Department of Labor comes out with the jobs report on the first Friday of every month. The last one was abysmal. I think we only had 38,000 jobs, and of those, 10,000 were created by government, not the private sector. When you see something like that, do you go, wow, or do you kind of say, you know, it might just be one blip on the screen and we need to kind of get several months at one time before we start reacting to that?
Well, I think I did say wow when I saw it because it was a much weaker number than what we were expecting. Part of that was a reflection of a strike associated with Verizon. But still, even if you add that effect back in, it was still a pretty weak number. Numbers probably closer to 70,000 than 38,000, but that was still quite low. On the other hand, we do try to put things in perspective. Those numbers can jump around month to month. So, you know, it's not my view that the 38,000 was really reflective of the course that the economy's on and the pace of job growth that we really expect to see going forward. But it was a low enough number to give us some pause.
Now, I'll say you as an organization are not political, so let me ask you something, and I'll try to make it non-political. Okay. But as we are in the middle of a presidential race, we are going to hear the candidates say different things that they would do to get the creation of jobs, and both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are saying that. When we look back, and by the way, that would be fiscal policy. They're going to say they're going to raise taxes, lower taxes, or something along those lines. I hear different people saying things like Ronald Reagan caused a deficit, the massive deficit because he cut taxes. When we cut taxes, is that, you've probably, I would guess, researched the result of tax cuts over time. What is the net effect of that typically for an economy, if you can say, and for revenue to the federal government?
Well, so it's a fairly complicated question, actually. So on the one hand, when you cut taxes, you may change incentives that are positive for the decision makers or the people who are receiving the tax cuts. You put a little bit more money in their pockets, which is potentially a good thing. But on the other hand, you have to finance those tax cuts either by borrowing or reducing government spending. And so whether or not that's a good thing depends upon kind of whether or not the government spending you either have to cut today or cut eventually to pay off the deficits you're incurring, whether those are really productive sort of cutting into the muscle sort of cuts, or whether they are bridges to nowhere or something like that. And so there's no rote answer to that question. The devil is always in the details, and those details, of course, are the things that people who make fiscal policy have to focus on most intently.
I might point out that George Bush had two tax cuts. One was a child tax cut where everyone got $1,000 a year for whatever kids they had, and the second tax cuts he had in 2003 were in the marginal tax rates. Mm-hmm. When we look at tax cuts, which would typically be more helpful to an economy? Is it the kind of thing where we give people $1,000 for their having a child, or where we would cut the marginal tax rates, in other words, lower the rates on what people pay on their income?
Well, if you take to heart the idea that the incentive effects of tax rates is what you really should be caring about, that is, you don't want to disincent people to earn income or to consume or whatever the case may be, the marginal tax rates will have the largest impact in that regard. But of course, there are lots of considerations that have to do with sort of what you think the appropriate social policy ought to be, which are, that's for people to decide on determining who they want to vote for. The economics, really are about something different than value judgments.
I suppose the best tax policy is to make it simple, kind of like sticking that carrot out in front of the donkey to get them to incentivize it to keep working and doing more and producing more.
Uncertainty about anything is the killer of growth, and so to the extent that simplifying makes things more certain and easier to make decisions, be they personal decisions or business decisions, the better off we'll be.
Let me ask you just a couple of last questions. How fast is the American economy growing at this time, and do you have a projection for where it might be in 2017, 2018?
Yeah, so my forecast is my forecast, and that of my colleagues on the staff at the Atlanta Fed. We're thinking that the first half of the year will have grown roughly somewhere in the neighborhood of 1.8 to 2%. Probably see something slightly better than that in the second half of the year. So we would guess we get GDP growth this year of somewhere in the neighborhood of 2%. I think that's our current guess.
Do you have a projection for the next 2 years, or do you?
Well, the next 2 years I don't think would be too dissimilar from that. We're hoping for something maybe a little better, but right now something around 2 to 2.25% seems like the best guess.
Am I correct that we need growth of approximately 2.5% to absorb those coming into the workforce?
No, I actually think that it's likely that 2 to 2.25 will do the trick. Part of that is a reflection of the permanent pace of the economy is probably a little lower than 2%, maybe 1.75%. So that would be the potential growth of the economy over the next couple of years. And if we grow moderately above that, we'll make moderate progress on absorbing people into the labor force who are still waiting on the sidelines.
All right. David Alte, we appreciate you taking time to speak with us.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.